Welcome everyone to our second to last call through Welty at Home of The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. We're going to be talking about part 4 today. And I wanted to just make a quick update about some upcoming events we have here at the Welty House. This Wednesday from 11:30 to 1, we will be hosting an event called Margaret Walker and Eudora Welty Remembering Medgar Evers. And that's in partnership with the Margaret Walker Center. We'll be discussing Welty's and Walker's writings on Medgar Evers. And it's going to be a really wonderful event. It won't be live streamed, but it will be recorded. And we'll share that recording on social media if you'd like to watch that after the event takes place. You're not able to come. And then this Saturday is our plant sale. We were talking a little bit about the plant sale before we got started here. It starts at 9. There will be coffee available if you want to show up early and grab a cup of coffee beforehand. And all of the plants at the plant sale are the same historic varieties that Welty has in her garden, either propagated directly from the Welty garden or those same historic varieties. So we're going to have a lot of plants, but they do sell quickly. And I'd also like to make an announcement about our next book. So as y'all know, we alternate between a book by Eudora Welty and a book by an author who's connected to Welty in some way. And our next book is going to be Welty's collection of short stories, The Wide Net. And we will get started on our next book club May 16th. And so we're really looking forward to reading through that one with everyone. Suzanne, do you want to add anything else?
No, I think that's good. It was stories in The Wide Net that first started me writing about Eudora Welty, so I look forward to talking about those.
All right.
I thought, shall I go ahead, Lauren?
Yeah, go for it.
I just loved last time when Jay talked about the sections in The Sound and the Fury evoking James Joyce, Ernest Hemingway, and Mark Twain. And so that was so much fun to think about it. And then he also set us up, and I want to bring up another writer today at the appropriate moment that I think he is invoking. And then also for him to say that Faulkner is preparing us for this section of the novel, which is set in the present time and is narrated we have a narrative voice, the author's narrative voice throughout the section, so that we get descriptions of characters and places that we've not had access to before. So I thought we might start off with those descriptions because they are startling, I think, to read. And the first, of course, is, as we open the section, is of Dilsey. So if we look at the descriptions of Dilsey, Jason, and Benji, we've not seen any of them described much before. And then we'll look at the description of Reverend Shegog. And then so I like to do that first, and then to talk about the action and the structure of the section, which is much more clearly structured than previously, and why Faulkner chose the order in which he did. And then finish up talking about the novel and the focus on time that comes about here. So that's what I have in store for today, if that suits everyone. If not, you're always free to raise your hand and change our order of business. Okay, so first, the description of Dilsey. Dilsey opened the door of the cabin and emerged. I should have started this. I'll just start at the beginning. The day dawned bleak and chill, a moving wall of gray light out of the northeast, which, instead of dissolving into moisture, seemed to disintegrate into minute and venomous particles like dust that, when Dilsey opened the door of the cabin and emerged, needled laterally into her flesh, precipitating not so much a moisture as a substance partaking of the quality of thin, not quite congealed oil. She wore a stiff black straw hat perched upon her turban and a maroon velvet cape with a border of mangy and anonymous fur above a dress of purple silk. And she stood in the door for a while with her myriad and sunken face lifted to the weather and one gaunt hand flax-soled as the belly of a fish. Then she moved the cape aside and examined the bosom of her gown. The gown fell gauntly from her shoulders across her fallen breast, then tightened upon her paunch, and fell again, ballooning a little above the nether garments, which she would remove layer by layer as the spring accomplished and the warm days, in color regal and moribund. She had been a big woman once, but now her skeleton rose, draped loosely in unpadded skin that tightened again upon a paunch almost dropsical, as though muscle and tissue had been courage or fortitude, which the days or the years had consumed, until only the indomitable skeleton was left rising like a ruin or a landmark above the somnolent and impervious guts. And above that, the collapsed face that gave the impression of the bones themselves being outside the flesh, lifted into the driving day with an expression at once fatalistic and of a child's astonished disappointment, until she turned and entered the house again and closed the door. So the first thing we read in this section of the novel, Easter Sunday, April 8th, is this description of Dilsey. What about that description of Dilsey? What do you think its import is for this section, for the meaning of the novel? Anyone want to start us off? What about the style of the passage? Yeah, Marcia. We can't hear you, Marcia.
It's a very brief comment. She's the anchor. I think she anchors this section, and the solidity, the vastness, although it's shrunken and she's thinner now and you can see her bones, she is still the anchor of the house, the family, and the story.
She is enduring. She is surviving. She is strong. She has guts. Jacob.
Just to add to all those good points, just one of the first times in the book where we see a character deeply and intensely, and I think consciously on Faulkner's part, embodied. Mm-hmm. That we are studying Dilsey's materiality, her presence. All the other sections are kind of told through the perspective of a mind. They're I guess a big word would be phenomenological, right? How people perceive and think. This time we are simply looking at the material that makes up Dilsey, and she is heavy like an anchor. She has presence and weight and guts.
Beverly, and then Jo Ellen.
This section too, in addition to all of that, I was reminded that she is old, and the times that she had to drag herself up and down those steps, and they are all sitting there hearing her when they're sending her up to do this, or they're sending her, and nobody seems to be, and and I know this is the times, and which the story set and all of that, but Faulkner is showing not only how dedicated she is to the family, instead of saying, I'm not going, Miss Caroline, can you meet me halfway down and I'll hand you this water bottle? Or, she is just struggling to carry out what I assume she, is very dedicated to as her duties. But it hurt me every time the description of her walking, especially up those stairs, and how ponderous it was, and how she just kept on going, even though it had to have been murderous on her, she did it anyway. Her dedication to them is remarkable.
All right, yeah. Jo Ellen.
Um, I think that the word weight used in connection with Dilsey is accurate, but she's also utterly fragile. And I felt that this section opened by smacking us in the face with this is the woman that everything is depending on for these people. And Beverly's right. We hear in the one section where Mrs. Thompson could hear her, but then the narrative voice shifts to describing the painful slowness. And we get that all the time. And then there's that other wonderful moment when Mrs. Thompson has gone into her room or something, but she can see Dilsey dropping her face like cows do in the rain.
Yeah.
It's just like a kind of not disappointment, not just resignation, but that just struck me. And the other thing is that clothing really matters in describing characters here. Some of them we only learn about through their clothes, like Phroney, but we get an image of Dilsey's two worlds, the kitchen and the church, in quite a lot of detail, and what she's wearing over that collapsed flesh and the bones. It's really amazing.
And the objective description is not really objective. I mean, the fur is mangy and anonymous. Or she has she's an indomitable skeleton, like a ruin or a landmark, so that there is that kind of interpretive language. Elta and Chris next.
It's so beautifully done. Dilsey knows who she is, and she knows who all of the others are as well. She knows them through and through. She will persist, and she will endure, and she will do her duty, but she'll call them out at the same time. She'll call out Jason for who he is and call him by his first name. We've talked about that before, her use of, and that's totally atypical. It's a way outside the limits for that time period, of really pretty much for any. But it's just an extraordinary picture of a person who is accepted, and also the kindness, the fact that she refers to Benji when she talks to Benji, and even when she talks to young Quentin, she says honey. There's not another word of endearment anywhere in this novel.
Not from family members for each other.
No, not at all.
Chris, and then we'll look at Jason. Yeah.
Well, first, I just thought the writing was so beautiful. Before Faulkner's been writing through the voice of his characters, but this is kind of completely different, and just the description of the rain being like congealed oil. I mean, you can remember feeling rain like that, but I don't think I ever would have found the right words to describe it. And I guess the last little part where it talks about her face, lifting up with this fatalistic expression or the disappointment of a child, it just kind of took my breath away. Like, oh my gosh, this is going to be heavy. This last part is, as I said, I'm a first-time reader, so y'all have given some hints about what's going to happen, but just that first section, I knew I better be prepared.
Yeah, I really would like to be reading it for the first time again. And I was struck by that fatalism, and then the childlike disappointment. That's still the innocence, the hopefulness,
right.
The realism, but the hopefulness. Let's look at the description of Jason, if we can, on page 279. So Dilsey has gone up to find Quentin. Quentin, she said. When she called the first time, Jason laid his knife and fork down, and he and his mother appeared to wait across the table from one another in identical attitudes. The one cold and shrewd, with close thatched brown hair curled into two stubborn hooks, one on either side of his forehead, like a bartender in caricature, and hazel eyes with black ringed irises like marbles, the other cold and querulous, with perfectly white hair and eyes pooched and baffled and so dark as to appear to be all pupil or all iris. All right, what about this first view of Jason and the way we see him? Why do you think Faulkner has chosen to give us this sort of appearance for this man? Those two little curlicues on his forehead, you've seen that, like a bartender in caricature. Why this appearance for Jason? Does it tell us anything about him, Beverly?
I think the two adjectives that are used, cold and shrewd, are good ones for him. I mean, he is cold, but he's always thinking of how to get around, how to make Quentin's life more difficult. Why not? Delcy says to him, let her sleep. And oh, no, he can't do that. So I think, I have a picture of him with the little curlicues almost being somewhat boyish. But then when he's described as cold and shrewd, that is not boyish. That is the Jason that we have seen in the other, that we see here too, when he goes upstairs, that we've seen in the other sections as well.
Also, don't you think that's a lot of trouble to go to? He goes to more trouble with his hair than I go to with mine. So there's that kind of affected quality about him. Marcia and then Harriet.
That's exactly what I was going to say. He has this self-image of him that we've seen before in his own section, that he is quite the man. He will show others how to do things. And the curls, which are so affected, are part of that. His self-image is quite different from the way he actually appears to others, because he looks like a caricature of a bartender, though he thinks he's quite the fixed up, ready to go to town type of character.
Yeah, suave and debonair.
Right. And so once again, I laugh at him. Once again.
Yeah. Harriet.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the cartoon quality of the description. A bartender in caricature, with these hooks. It's like I'm seeing a cartoon, I'm reading in the Kindle Vintage International, which is in theory the same edition that you're reading, but I have cold and querulous rather than cold and shrewd.
That's what cold and querulous is. Mrs. Compson.
No, right here. In this passage, I have black ringed irises like marbles, the other cold and querulous with perfectly white hair. Is that Mrs. Compson?
That's Mrs. Compson.
Oh, okay. I searched, and so I thought I was in the same place.
Because earlier it says that one cold and shrewd with close thatched brown hair. So
good. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Good. With the cartoon-like quality, the caricature, the New Yorker cartoon.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else about Jason?
Suzanne, I'll just share. I had this thought too. Sally in the chat said 2 curls, the devil's horns.
Oh,
kind of in reverse, but you do get that image.
Let's look at the description of Benji on 274. Okay, so here is the description. Lester entered, followed by a big man who appeared to have been shaped of some substance whose particles would not or did not cohere to one another or to the frame which supported it. His skin was dead-looking and hairless, dropsical too. He moved with a shambling gait, like a trained bear. His hair was pale and fine. It had been brushed smoothly down upon his brow, like that of children and daguerreotypes. His eyes were clear, of the pale, sweet blue of cornflowers. His thick mouth hung open, drooling a little. So here we see Benji. What's the impact of this passage, do you think? What parts of the description do you focus on? Yeah, John? We can't hear you yet.
There we go. The one thing, first of all, it breaks my heart to read this, and then I do think it's important to on 275 there are other descriptions of Ben or Benji, and it said there's this description. He's sitting by the stove. He sat loosely, utterly motionless, save for his head, which made a continual bobbing sort of movement as he watched Dilsey with his sweet, vague gaze as she moved around. And then there's another one that when she takes him into the bathroom, the dining room, and it's over on 276, she returned and set a plate at the kitchen table and set food there. Oh, that's right. Ben stayed in the kitchen. Ben watched her being Dilsey, slobbering, making a faint, eager sound. And
that's where she says, "All right, honey," as Elsa is pointing out here. So here is this man slobbering, but she's saying, "All right, honey." Yeah.
Yeah. I can't help but think that, I think Faulkner is telling us, or the narrator is telling us that, that Benji is observing accurately and taking in himself some of the things that are going on around him, and he's reacting to that. And I just think what it also leads me to think is if they had worked with him more, if they had worked with him through the years, he might have actually acquired some verbal skills, but he is now at a point in his life where he has no verbal skills whatsoever. And that's just speculation on my part, but I thought I really had a different understanding of Benji from these descriptions than I did from the first chapter of the book.
All right, good. Joe Ellen?
Oh, you're muted, Joe Ellen.
Yep.
I couldn't get beyond the passage saying the particles would not or did not cohere to one another or to the frame which supported it. I didn't even remember the trained bear bit. That just took all of my time. And it struck me as maybe like John, a kind of Casper Hauser or an innocent type of Caliban, but just the stuff that people are made of, unmolded, unshaped. And I thought it was just odd. I'm still not quite sure what to make of it, but it just smacked me.
And maybe that's what John is suggesting too, that there's that thought, if only they had tried to shape, to mold. The shambling gait like a trained bear, the particles not cohering, but the eyes, the pale, sweet blue of cornflowers. The kind of innocence about him, despite all of this. So here's this drooling, shambling, loony, as Lester would say, but there is that gaze, the pale, sweet blue of cornflowers in his eyes. Anything else about Ben? I do think it's kind of shocking to see him for the first time. This is what we have. All right. Well, I was going to go talk about, look at the description of Reverend Shegog. Maybe that's where we should start. Then I'd like to talk about the two middle sections of the novel, which take place simultaneously. Dilsey's going to church, and Jason's trying to chase down his money and Miss Quentin. And Faulkner has decided to tell us about Dilsey going to church first and about Jason second. So that's an important decision there that we could talk about. But then I do think we want to talk about Dilsey and the sermon and the response to the sermon. Marcia? Whoops, we can't hear you, Marcia.
Always forget. The description of this sermon itself, what he says, the reaction of the congregation, and how he changes his voice, etc., his whole performance made me think of Powerhouse. It made me think of the way Eudora Welty describes, and who is it? I forget the entertainer she's describing, but anyway, the story Powerhouse.
Fats Waller.
Fats Waller, right? And after I read that, of course, I looked up on YouTube Fats Waller, and it's fascinating to see him performing and to have her description. But that's what it made me think of, and I thought that's very much the style that she used when she depicted Fats Waller. That's
interesting. I think I could give, if I were still teaching, I'd give that as a paper topic. Let's look at the description of him, because it's their congregation is really disappointed when they see him, and the description seems so stereotypical. I want to talk about what you make of that. The visitor was undersized. This is on 293. The visitor was undersized in a shabby alpaca coat. He had a wizened face, a wizened black face, like a small, aged monkey. And all the while that the choir sang, and while the 6 children rose and sang in thin, frightened, tuneless whispers, they watched the insignificant-looking man sitting dwarfed and countrified by the minister's imposing bulk, with something like consternation. So, what about that description of him and the congregation's disappointment? He had a wizened black face like a small, aged monkey. This is right out of kind of a racist trope, isn't it? What's going on here? Why that description, do you think? What's Faulkner doing with it? Joe Ellen?
I think we'll get into this more when we get into the sermon, but he's clearly setting us up for the transformation that's seen. But as in Powerhouse, where Powerhouse is a Black man described by or written about from the perspective of a white community, I think we have the Black community in the congregation here, but I think there's a kind of communal reaction, communal voice. We're seeing them en masse, which we see again during the sermon.
Mm-hmm.
I think that just establishing the congregation as such and setting us up for what comes next.
I agree. I think that's really important, that they respond as one throughout the sermon and into the appearance here. To me also, that this description of him is set up for what comes next to undermine that dismissive sort of stereotype, so that you look at him and you're going to dismiss him, but then what happens afterwards undermines, to me, that stereotype. So it's Faulkner undercutting that, I would suggest. Harriet?
I'm not thrilled with it, but I do notice the repetition throughout this passage, so that the next time he uses the term, he says, they listened at first to curiosity as they would have to a monkey talking. I mean, it is what Joan's pointing us to, which is that sense of a setup for us to move beyond.
Yeah, Joellen and then Jacob.
I just had a quick follow-up. What I really noticed was, or wondered about, was whether that communal voice in that paragraph about the undersized, wizened, insignificant, dwarfed, and countrified Shigog was more a white voice of a narrator, which we also get in the similar things going on in Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily. I both see the congregational voice as a group, but also wonder about the narrator here.
Yeah, I think the narrator is trying to move into the minds of the congregation, but it is from the narrator's voice. So Jacob?
I agree with the notions of Faulkner kind of setting us up for the deconstruction of these stereotypes. I also think that the 3 sections leading up to this moment have also kind of set us up for what's occurring. That is to say, we've already witnessed the intensity of interiority, right? That interiority is a totally different beast from what we see of these characters. So we should know now that all of these characters, including the Reverend, including Dilsey, have broiling subliminal selves that undermine whatever we see that's occurring, on the facade of things. So, I mean, this is what he really runs with in the very next novel after Sound and the Fury. As I Lay Dying, we're plumbing interiorities that are not what we see. So I think Benji and Quentin and Jason have already set us up for that. So what we're seeing, we should be kind of doubting to an extent.
Let's think about the sermon. So the sermon is, first he speaks in the cold voice of a white man, and that's an amazing performance. And then his voice takes on the tone of an alto horn, and he's still using more traditionally white pronunciation, but it has a sad timbrous quality. And then he becomes, he speaks in dialect. So we move through these 3 sections, and the more he speaks, the more powerful his effect upon the congregation. What do you make of this sermon and its the imagery, the biblical passages it draws upon, and its shift in tone? What stands out about the sermon to you? Anyone? Easter Sunday. Harriet.
So the sermon is about sacrifice. It is about Christ's sacrifice. It is about the recollection of the blood of the Lamb. And that, of course, ties back to Dilsey. I think there's more to say about Dilsey, which is not really where I'm going at the moment. So on the one hand, we're back to ideas about sacrifice, endurance, compassion. And at another level, we're interested in a sermon that is not really about words as usual, but is about a kind of chant that develops a call and response from the audience, with an emphasis on moving beyond words. And I think that's important in terms of what Faulkner has tried for in this novel, what he succeeded at, which is moving us beyond words as usual, with maybe a suspicion of words as usual. And instead we get a communication that happens beyond words.
A communication and a sense of community of the people responding emotionally, in a way beyond words, together. And there is no, I think, white community that we see. The Black community is the only one we see. John?
I recently attended an Ash Wednesday service where there was a lot of clergy from the from the denomination that the church was a part of. And then there was it was a combined service with two different, predominantly white, but an inner city church in Jackson, and then a virtually all Black church in North Jackson. And so it was a combined service. There were a lot of clergy there because, as somebody pointed out, all the clergy who spoke in the service, all of their children were clergy in the same faith.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm getting to is when finally an African-American minister did the sermon, and the first part of it was for the clergy, and then the second part of it was for the congregations. And it was totally different.
Mm.
And she was speaking to the audience in two very different ways. And so I think that, I think preachers, I've seen preachers do that before. And she really came home and did this. And it was very, but anyway, I just wanted to say that. Then you were asking about the imagery. The imagery is on, when he's speaking to the congregation, that's on 296. So some of that is the most powerful stuff. I'd never heard the image of Mary looking out the door with baby Jesus and the Roman soldiers walking by saying, "We're going to kill your child." That is very powerful. And I've never seen that before. So then going on to the Easter Sunday and being on Calvary and Golgotha, that is just as powerful. And it is it's in about half a page, and boy, the Faulkner can just take images and compress language, and it's just extraordinary. And let me say this, I think Eudora Welty can do the same thing, and I think she did in Delta Wedding, but they do it in different ways. And I just thought that was an extraordinary part of this book, that sermon.
Yeah, he draws upon a lot of different biblical passages and pulls them all together in a in very quick fashion, from the Egyptian captivity to the crucifixion. So Joe Ellen.
Yeah, Harriet used the word beyond of the sermon, and I want to add that we go beyond sense, in part with Mary looking out the door with the babe in hand and talking to the Roman soldiers. But on page 295, we have, they passed away into Egypt, they're swinging chariots into package. We have the rich man in heaven, all kinds of things get collapsed for the same effect that chant does, that Harriet mentioned. And in fact, before we were very far into this, I was thinking of Father Mapple in Moby Dick, Herman Melville's novel.
Oh, yeah.
And then as we get, I was carried even further by lines like on 294, successive waves of his voice. And the voice took them into himself. His voice feeds on him and is all consuming. And I could just see Ahab, the less consequential looking character, bringing the ship, the sailors around, pulling this entire community with him. And that's what happens here for other purposes, of course. But that's really what I was thinking about in terms of him Faulkner creating the real sense of the unit of the congregation before.
I want to say also that there is a question here not only of salvation, redemption, having the recollection and the blood of the Lamb, but of judgment. I ain't going to overload heaven. You better have that recollection, because I ain't going to overload heaven. So there's that notion as well. And we'll talk about that impact on Dilsey. Yeah, Beverly, Cheryl had something too, I think. I've lost her though.
I was taken by the description of Ben and Dilsey in the church.
Right.
In the midst of the voices and the hands, Ben sat, wrapped in his sweet blue gaze. Dilsey sat upright beside, crying rigidly and quietly in the annealment and the blood of the remembered lamb. And then when they leave and everybody's talking about how, he sure is a preacher, he sees the power and the glory, Dilsey doesn't say anything. I mean, she was just so taken, and she continues to cry.
Mhm.
And Frony says to her, "Why don't you quit that, Mammy? All these people looking, we be passing white folks soon." And she said, "I see the first and the last, never you mind me. First and last what? Never you mind. I see the beginning and now I see the ending." So her response, even though it's a visible vocal response with her crying, her response is a much more personal one, I think, because she's not talking about it. She is just internalizing what he said and how that relates to her and the people that she lives with.
And it's not of the possibility of salvation for them. I see the first and the last. So what she takes away, how does that come from the sermon? How does this response emerge from the sermon, do you think?
I take that as a reference to Revelations and the Alpha and the Omega. That
All
Jesus,
right.
the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, and that she sees Jesus Christ as a result of this sermon. That's what I.
And I think that's right. So I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And so that she emerges from that with that sense of unity and that revelation. But I think it also, don't you think it also applies to the Compsons? I've seen the first and I've seen the last. Jacob and then Cheryl.
I'd like to defer to Cheryl first, and I'll come in because I've already talked.
Right. Okay, Cheryl. Whoops, we can't hear you.
Thank you. I just want to distract or derail the path that the conversation was going on. That's why I previously lowered my hand. But I just wanted to note when someone mentioned Moby Dick, that Moby Dick was actually one of Faulkner's favorite novels. He really, really enjoyed Melville's writing. And The Sound and the Fury, Faulkner had said the novel that he was his favorite because he anguished the most over it and worked the hardest at it. And in retrospect, for a reader, 80 years later, there are so many layers of and reflections on human behavior that I don't even think Faulkner knew that he was writing into the story. So back to what we were saying about Benji's description, the first time that the reader reads a visual description of him, I think that Faulkner was able to intuitively interpret a mentally disabled individual's characters, his mannerisms, and how that person perceived the world before a label, a word like autism could be, or Down syndrome could be applied to it. And the way that Reverend Shagog he begins approaching the audience in one way and then transitions his tone and his manner of his dialect to another, is, I think, just an intuitive way of a person speaking to the right audience and knowing how to address them. And I don't think that it's anything unique to the Black community. If I go to another country, I would immediately try to adopt some of their mannerisms to fit in, and yeah. So I think that was my point regarding that, and the extras that I wanted to throw in.
I'm glad you brought up the Melville link. My students always tell me that no matter what I teach, I bring in Moby Dick. So that's good to bring in Moby Dick. There we go. Jacob.
I don't even remember what I was going to say, but I'll say this about Moby Dick. Who's Ahab in this section? It's Jason. It's
Yeah.
Jason. There's that remarkable passage. I'm in a different version. It's right after the Reverend scene. And it's when Jason gets so mad, he starts like capitalizing omnipotence. He almost sounds like the devil in Paradise Lost. Like he is going to wage war against Jefferson and anyone in his way, the sheriff, everyone, to get Quentin. He has a kind of Ahab obsession to catch, in this case, the girl who is the white whale. And he fails.
If God himself insulted me, I would strike. Yeah. So here, let's look at that passage about Jason. It's on 306, I think. Yeah. Of his niece, he did not think at all, nor of the arbitrary valuation of the money. Neither of them had entity or individuality for him for 10 years. Together, they merely, this is his white whale, they merely symbolize the job in the bank of which he had been deprived before he ever got it. And then later on, from time to time, he passed churches, unpainted frame buildings with sheet iron steeples surrounded by tethered teams and shabby motor cars. And it seemed to him that each of them was a picket post where the rear guards of circumstance peeped fleetingly back at him. And damn you too, he said, see if you can stop me. Thinking of himself, his file of soldiers with the manacled sheriff in the rear, dragging omnipotence down from his throne if necessary, of the embattled legions of both hell and heaven through which he tore his way and put his hands at last on his fleeing niece. I like that, Jacob. He is like kind of Ahab-like figure here. And so as opposed to Reverend Shegog, who's talking about the recollection and the blood of the lamb, we have Jason wanting to drag omnipotence down from his throne. Yeah. What else? What else about this? Jason. Oh, let's look also at Mottstown before we forget it, because here's where I think Fitzgerald may be coming in to play on 311. The eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. The show boss has rescued Jason. Keep going, the other said. He led Jason on around the corner of the station to the empty platform where an express truck stood, where grass grew rigidly in a plot bordered with rigid flowers and a sign and electric lights. Keep your eye on Motson. The gap filled by a human eye with an electric pupil. So we have a kind of wasteland here, and we have this eye staring out at it. And April is the cruelest month for Jason. We've got Elliot and the wasteland coming in, I think, too, and Fitzgerald and Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. Am I off on a riding a hobby horse here? Harriet?
No, I don't think so. But I think that brings us back to the modern and to the idea of the first and the last, and the contrast between the idea of resurrection in Easter and the reality of the Comptons who will not be resurrected, who are not in transformation, so
when Dilsey says she's seen the last, here is Jason pointing that up.
Right.
Yeah. Cheryl.
Yes, so we've seen the first and the last, but technically don't know what happens to Miss Quentin. And in the Compson appendix that Faulkner wrote for the Malcolm Cowley portable Faulkner, like 20 or 30 years later, Suzanne, you probably have a better idea of the exact date of when that
1946, I think it was.
So in expanding upon the major characters in The Sound and the Fury, and then at the end, where at the end of his description of the Compsons and the primary white characters, he then says, and it seems very short, and if you're not familiar with Faulkner, I think that it could appear that this is disrespectful to Dilsey and other Black characters in the book. He just simply says, and that was all. These others were not Compson, they were Black. And there are just 2 or 3 sentence descriptions for them. And then he does TP, he does Franny, he does Lester, and then he does Dilsey at the end. And her description is the shortest of all. It's simply 2 words. It's they endured. And then it's not she endured, it's they endured. So then the question to think about is who is the they in this? Is it Dilsey and her immediate family? Is it Dilsey and particular members of the Black community, or Dilsey and particular Compson family members who were able to eventually do the right thing, who endured? And there's no answer. It just says they endured. So it's for the reader to interpret.
And a short sentence has a lot of power.
Yes.
By virtue of its shortness. Yeah. Laura.
Yeah, to expand kind of what Harriet and Cheryl were both saying about this modernity and like looking forward, I feel like centering around like Motson or Mottstown, maybe Faulkner's way of beginning the germ for As I Lay Dying, which comes immediately next, where Dewey Dowell uses the pharmacy in Mottstown in her attempts to procure the abortion. And there's this perfect kind of intersection of modernity or the traditional pharmacist, and maybe even this kind of what could happen to Miss Quentin, like a kind of alternative. She then transforms into Dewey Dowell in the next sequential novel of Faulkner's career.
All right. Yeah. So we'll think about the interconnections here. Too bad we're not going on to read As I Lay Dying. Anything else about Jason and this section that follows the sermon? Shall we look at the ending of the novel, On the Square? And just read that and talk about that to finish up today. So Jason, totally defeated, can't drive himself back, has to pay $4 to get himself back. Has not found Quentin, has not found his money. By the way, I looked up $3,000 in 1928 would be worth today $50,000. So Jason has a ton of money stashed in his closet, right? So Lester has taken Benji and the Surrey to the square. They approached the square where the Confederate soldier gazed with empty eyes beneath his marble hand in wind and weather. Lester took still another notch in himself and gave the impervious Queenie a cut with the switch, casting his glance round the square. "They're Mr. Jason Carr," he said. Then he spied another group of Negroes. "Let's show them how quality does, Benji," he said. "What you say?" He looked back. Ben sat holding the flower in his fist, his gaze empty and untroubled. Lester hit Queenie again and swung her to the left at the monument. For an instant, Ben sat in an utter hiatus. Then he bellowed, bellow on bellow. His voice mounted with scarce interval for breath. There was more than astonishment in it. It was horror, shock, agony, eyeless, tongueless, just sound. And Lester's eyes back rolling for a white instant. "Great God," he said. "Hush, hush, great God." He whirled again and struck Queenie with the switch. It broke and he cast it away, and with Ben's voice mounting toward its unbelievable crescendo, Lester caught up the ends of the reins and leaned forward as Jason came jumping across the square and onto the step. With a backhanded blow, he hurled Lester aside and caught the reins and sawed Queenie about and doubled the reins back and slashed her across the hips. He cut her again and again into a plunging gallop. while Ben's hoarse agony roared about them and swung her about to the right of the monument. Then he struck Luster over the head with his fist. "Don't you know any better than to take him to the left?" he said. He reached back and struck Ben, breaking the flower stalk again. "Shut up," he said, "shut up." He jerked Queenie back and jumped down. "Get to hell on home with him. If you ever cross that gate with him again, I'll kill you." "Yes, sir," Lester said. He took the reins and hit Queenie with the end of them. Get up there, Benji, for God's sake." Ben's voice roared and roared. Queenie moved again. Her feet began to clop, clop steadily again, and at once Ben hushed. Lester looked quickly back over his shoulder. Then he drove on. The broken flower drooped over Ben's fist, and his eyes were empty and blue and serene again as cornice and facade flowed smoothly once more from left to right, post and tree, window and doorway and signboard, each in its ordered place. All right, now one of the most famous passages in all of Faulkner. We need to talk about it. How do you respond to this ending of the novel? The two places where you pay most attention in any piece of literature, the first paragraph and the last, right? And here we have, this is the end. Yeah. Jacob.
You can at least start off, if we go back to the first sentence, just pulling from memory, that we start with Luster and Benji.
Mm-hmm.
And we are looking through the fence in a broken place. That is the beginning. And the end, the last thing is that we're in the ordered, everything is in its ordered place. So just putting those side by side, it seems to me that it's a very modernist moment where Faulkner is drawing attention to, while deconstructing notions of disorder and order, right? At the very beginning, we are literally discombobulated in a broken place. We don't know what the heck is going on. At the end, we know exactly what's going on. And we are looking at everything in its ordered place, but we know this is a very dysfunctional story.
Yeah.
So that's my examination of those two.
It's an order, but a meaningless order. It's not the order that Dilsey thinks, that Dilsey believes in, but it's an order of an artificially constructed.
A violent order.
Right. And oh yeah, Jason hits him, strikes him. Harriet.
Yeah, I want to talk about Benji as the reader's double in this book, and the way in which we have been howling along with Ben. As we want narrative order, as we want to be able to make meaning and can't. And now we've reached this point where we have put in the chronology and the capitals and commas and are making meaning from this order. But it somehow I feel suspect of what we're doing in the way that you say this order is not the right order, is a troubled order.
It's an order, but it's one that doesn't offer the order Dilsey sees offers her validation of a concept, of an interpretation of experience. This is merely one that's comforting, but has no not the validation that Quentin was seeking, for instance, in some sort of cosmic order. Anything else here about the ending? I mean, when I'm kind of wanting to go back to what Jacob said about the violence here, when he strikes Luster, when Jason strikes Luster and then strikes Ben, I'm like Harriet, I'm the reader that's howling here at this, howling at the state of affairs. Don't you know any better to take him to the left? He reached back and struck Ben, breaking the flower stalk again, and yells at him, "Shut up." And then he says to Lester, "If you cross that gate again, I'll kill you." Maybe an idle threat, but a horrifying one. Yeah, Chris.
I guess when, Dilsey said, I've seen the beginning and I see the end after the church service, I kind of took it that, Dilsey really knows everything that goes on in that house. And she knew what happened with the money with Miss Quinton. And thinking about it in church, she knows how this is going to play out. That, Jason's going to get his way and no longer be taking care of these Black people that he says he has to feed every day that don't, do what he thinks they should. And he wants his brother committed in Jackson. He wants a different life. And I think she sees that that's how this is, what happened that morning is going to play out in the end. And then when you see him return back home with this violence and threats and, it's just so tragic, I guess, was my main reaction, just sadness.
Yeah. Joe Ellen. Whoops, we're not hearing you. We're not hearing you still yet.
I'm just rounding back to Melville. The facade flows smoothly once more from left to right, each in its ordered place. And I heard, again, because Melville had been in my mind, the great shroud of the sea rolled on as it rolled 5,000 years ago, which ups the ante in terms of the order, the levels of order that Faulkner might be thinking about or using ironically.
All right. We're out of time. I did have, this is the state of being 75 years old. I did have something I thought was important to say, but I lost it. So there you are. Maybe it'll come back to me in the next 5 minutes and I'll say it next time, but it couldn't be too important. So Lauren, anything else we need to do before we sign off today?
I don't think so. Just look for the recording coming your way this afternoon. And there's also links to all the other week's recordings except for one. So if you need to catch up, you can check those out as well. And we'll see you next week.
All right. We
Thank
get
you.
Jay next week. Looking forward to it. Bye-bye.